I'm Emily. I'm currently working on my PhD at the University of Abertay, and I'm coming from kind of an art history and museum studies background to look at the history of video game exhibitions and the acceptance of video games in art institutions. While many art and design institutions have recently put on shows about video games and even added games to their collection, the connection between art museums and galleries and video games goes back further than most people would guess. In 1989, the Museum of the Moving Image in New York presented Hot Circuits, which is the first major exhibition of games by a collecting institution. But artists were making and presenting custom games like Mike Builds a Shelter by Michael Smith in art venues as early as 1983. In fact, there are whole histories of these kind of art world and homebrew activities which led to the display and collection of what essentially are video games, mods, or ROM hacks in art institutions through the 90s and early 2000s. But the connection is rarely drawn between these sorts of exhibitions and these sorts of practices and attempts to describe the history of video games or the history of collecting and displaying video games, even if kind of broader definitions of indie or art game are included in that history. And this sort of divide that's created is an example of how art institutions, and specifically the exhibition form, don't simply relay existing history to us, but they play an active role in constructing it. So for at least 25 years now, exhibitions of video games have been temporarily on display at major institutions. You have major touring exhibitions like the Art of Video Games and game masters that are traveling across the countries and continents. And some institutions have even opened specifically for the display and collection of games, for their historical value and merit as art and design objects. And others have incorporated video games into a broader collection of art and design objects. So as video games are being accepted by the art world, what kind of history is being asserted by these collection and exhibition choices? Bruce Altshuler describes the temporary exhibition, which is the now dominant form with which contemporary art is conveyed, as a route into art history. So examining these exhibitions and their rhetorical and display techniques is kind of vital if we want to be reflective about these practices. And for a very ephemeral and technological form that video games take, these issues are even more urgent to consider. The development of a history of games also owes a massive debt to legally gray practices of fans and collectors, including hardware modifications, emulation, and piracy, prohibited by the companies that generally control the IP and distribution of the games. And they also kind of rely on, kind of wikis and crowdsourced information. But to rely on these methods to make a history of games is to rely on kind of freely given amateur labor that can simply not be done or that can be subject to legal takedowns at any time. So ideally, institutions would step up and build on the trails that have been blazed by these fans and enthusiasts, and also develop kind of legal long-term solutions with the resources that are beyond what's available to an individual. So, this is kind of a starting off example. This is how Pac-Man is displayed at MoMA's Applied Design exhibition in 2013. And you can tell, the screen is displaying kind of the very iconic Pac-Man maze design and characters, and visitors to the gallery are able to come up and control it with the arcade-style joystick that's there on the kind of floating plinth thing. But the structure of the arcade cabinet art, and even the display that would have originally been, a CRT monitor behind glass, all these things are missing from this display choice. And these games, by MoMA's collecting strategy, are collected as examples of interaction design. And by the MoMA's judgment, the site of this interaction, and therefore what's worth collecting and conserving, is the code of the game itself, which can then be emulated through a whole bunch of different interfaces. And Paola Antonelli, who was the curator responsible for these decisions, kind of states her intent in the approach quite clearly, saying that getting the source code from companies that own these games is kind of the ultimate aspiration of their collecting strategy. And she uses words like paraphernalia or arcade nostalgia to kind of describe things, like the arcade cabinet or other materials that would go along with how the game is presented. This is an example of how Pac-Man was presented at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in 2012, which was a few months before Pac-Man was shown at the MoMA. And this is a case of the game also being emulated off of its original hardware and not run on its original components. But this time it's projected into this kind of curved nook type of space in the gallery that multiple visitors can gather around while one person is playing. This layout is also not strictly true to the arcade setting that you would have originally, or kind of this idealized, authentic encounter with Pac-Man, but it does show a greater awareness of elements of spectatorship in addition to the direct interaction with the game, which colors how visitors can experience and learn and think about the games that are on display. And this is the example from the show that I mentioned earlier at the Museum of the Moving Image, Hot Circuits in 1989. And all of the games here were kind of in the original arcade cabinets. And the visitors were even given a set number of tokens that they could use in the machines to kind of contribute to the additional contextualization of what the experience would have been like. However, this was not strictly a recreation of arcade space in a gallery. The cabinets were set away from the wall a little bit. There's obviously some kind of strategic lighting and contextualizing texts on the wall provided. And also, they were kind of given space between them. So normally, in a very busy arcade, all of the machines would kind of be very much closer or flush against each other. But the goal there was to kind of make the cabinet art and the cabinet itself kind of more appreciable as a sculptural object. And kind of despite this attempt to strike a balance between, the arcade setting and the gallery setting, it still led to some visitors engaging in destructive arcade-type behavior like jostling the machines or sticking gum on them, which leads to worries about the long-term conservation. So basically, each of these approaches has a different effect on the visitor experience and makes a different argument about what games are and what makes them aesthetically and historically important part of culture. Historicization and conservation are gated by the testing bed of these exhibitions, and so it becomes vital to interrogate what kind of gaming history we are creating through these selections and display strategies. And I would say the goal of investigating this is not to decide on one strategy or type of exhibition or institution that's best for doing these sorts of things, but rather to kind of do the opposite and question the existing strategies to discover the outer limits and ways in which this can be pressed, and new kind of curatorial or installation concerns based on visitor feedback, and looking at how to capture neglected areas of game history and aesthetic experience with games. So moving on to my current research, it draws from my background in contemporary art and art history, including a specific interest in game and new media related works, and where these themes can intersect with game studies. So part of this is generating a critical history and typology of video game exhibitions. But I also engage in a practical component where I kind of organize exhibitions to put these ideas into practice. So this is from a project that I did with Lindsay Grace for the first joint FDG Digger conference, which was last August. And this was kind of an experimental games display in a gallery, and normally it would have just been for the week of the conference, but we got to extend it for a few months. I was really, and these are all kind of unusual interfaces or ways of presenting games, but I also really enjoyed how we kind of meshed elements of interaction spectatorship in how we presented this game, which is You Must Be 18 or Older to Enter, which is a game about sneaking onto your parents' computer to look at porn as a kid. So experimenting with, these ideas of authentic experience, how you experience the game alone, at home, in an arcade, and all these different things, and how can we adapt this to the gallery to also make it a unique experience. And really just looking at those kind of things. I'd like to work in different contexts, like with festivals and also long-term collecting institutions, to kind of build on the context that I get to test out these ideas in. So that's where I am so far. Thanks for listening, and just thanks to everyone who made my first practical application of the project successful. All their names are up there.